All right. Hello and good
Rad.
afternoon, good morning, or good evening to you all, depending on where you may be joining us from. My name is Marie Anderson, and I will be your host throughout today's webinar. Thank you for tuning in and taking the time out of your busy schedules to join us. We have a ton of great content to share with you, and we're really excited to be with you here today. Today's webinar is titled Detect and Mitigate More Transfer Scams with Confidence, the Power of an Integrated Scam Prevention Strategy, presented by LexisNexis Risk Solutions. I'll dive into our agenda and introduce our speakers in a bit, but before I do so, let's cover some quick housekeeping items. Number one, your lines will be muted throughout the duration of the webinar. So if you have a question, and we strongly encourage any and every question you may have, please submit it through the Q&A feature at any time throughout the presentation, and then we'll host a formal Q&A session at the end. Number two, if for any reason we don't get to your question today, we will follow up with you individually within the next several days with an answer to your question. And then number three, in addition to Q&A, we will also be doing a few polls throughout the presentation. So please keep an eye out for those when I announce them, and we'd really appreciate your engagement and feedback on the poll questions. For our speakers today, we are joined by two extremely intelligent individuals who are really experts on this scams topic. First, we have Chris Schnieper, Senior Director of Fraud and Identity Strategy from LexisNexis Risk Solutions. Chris has over 20 years of experience working across a variety of different industries on strategic fraud challenges. He works with clients on how to protect their ecosystem using a variety of solutions. And he speaks and researches areas such as generative AI, scams, social engineering, and verifiable credentials. Prior to joining LexisNexis Risk Solutions, Chris has held positions with organizations such as Bank of America, Accenture, Early Warning Services, and American Express. He holds a bachelor's degree from Albright College and an MBA in accounting and technology from St. Joseph's University. We also have David Dayton on the call, Director of Fraud and Identity Solutions Consulting from LexisNexis Risk Solutions. David is a certified fraud examiner and has spent 25 plus years successfully building partnerships with a wide variety of organizations across the financial services industry. He brings extensive subject matter expertise within the identity theft and fraud markets, and he has directly interacted with many diverse organizations, helping them identify, understand, and set strategies for mitigating fraud. His knowledge comes from hands-on experience working for both LexisNexis Risk Solutions and Experian. And he holds a bachelor's degree in organizational communications from the University of Central Missouri, as well as a CFE credential from the Association of Certified Fraud Examiners. Like I said, we're very lucky to have these gentlemen with us today. Before I pass it over to them to get into the meat of our content today, I just want to cover the agenda very quickly. Okay, so you should all be able to see the agenda on the screen here. And to no one's surprise, we're here to talk about scams, the scale of the scam problem, and how your organization can fight back against scams. We'll cover a few key findings and insights in relation to scams in the financial services industry. We'll walk through the anatomy of an authorized transfer scam and what this looks like for your customers and your business. How you can detect and mitigate more scams with an integrated strategy or a multi-layered approach. And then how to get started with us. So at this point, David and Chris will do a panel discussion and really pick each other's brains for some key takeaways that you will not want to miss. And then, like I said, we'll wrap up everything and have time for Q&A at the end. So that does it for me. Chris, the floor is yours to get us started.
Awesome. Thanks, Marie. I really appreciate the opportunity to chat in front of everybody today. And before we get started, I certainly want to make a really big shout out to Marie and her team for putting all this together. Everything you see today is a lot of the work that Marie did. So we're certainly very appreciative of everything you've done to make this happen today. So I'd like to get started and talk a little bit about the scale of the problem. And as many of you are probably aware and painfully aware, not only is the scam threat increasing, it's evolving both in volume, but as well as different ways that fraudsters are utilizing scams in order to, defraud consumers from hard-earned money. Certainly, when we look at the losses, there are a number of different sources of that. Everything from the FTC, the FBI has a page, and there are a number of different sources. When I chat with different both folks that are part of these organizations that either conduct investigations or collect the data, a lot of times I hear that these dollars are probably underrepresented. It's unknown what it's underrepresented by, but certainly there's a strong belief that these numbers are underrepresented by, potentially a significant amount. So I think as time goes on and more consumers feel comfortable communicating that they have been scammed, how much they have been scammed, that we'll be able to see better numbers around this. And unfortunately, we certainly have a hypothesis that it's going to be increasing. So we certainly know that scams are out there and that they are unfortunately increasing. When we think about scams, one of the biggest challenges, and we'll be getting in, David and myself will be getting into this a little later. Certainly one of the biggest challenges is that in a scam itself, that the individual, the consumer, is being manipulated by some third party. And that third party is either manipulating or coercing them to conduct an authorized transfer themselves, or they're manipulating them in order to ascertain or get some type of either PII, credentials, some type of information to conduct an ATO. Just to set some context also for the webinar today, we'll be talking mostly about a transfer scam where the fraudster coerces or manipulates an individual to send funds or transfer value themselves. At some later time, we'll be focusing on the social engineering or a scenario where the fraudster harvests credentials or data from the consumer. And certainly when we think about these different type of authorized transfer scams, certainly the financial loss is a big challenge. What we're finding over time is that not only are consumers frustrated with that, but consumers are also saying if the resolution of that scam, where they call an institution to say, hey, I've been scammed, and the resolution of that is a loss to them, that's a scenario where many of them are going to close their account and leave the institution, which obviously is a challenge for organizations because it's the consumer that's actually authorizing the transfer, and sometimes without the right tools and without the right mitigation techniques, the institution doesn't even have the opportunity to reach out to the individual, to send a notification, to somehow prompt them that they feel that there's a challenge here. So certainly there's a lot of data that's suggesting that the information that or at least there's a lot of evidence that suggests that a lot of what we're hearing and seeing is that consumers are frustrated with not only the loss, but also how organizations are reacting to it. Next then is we certainly see that the research that we're doing is showing that not only in our the LexisNexis Risk Solutions True Cost of Fraud study, what we've found is not only is there an increase in scams, but also as the type of scams increases, the total loss has actually increased across different type of financial institutions. So as an example, if there's just one type of scam in U.S. banks, it would be approximately $4.14. But if there's three or more, that amount actually jumps significantly. So we can certainly see that not only is it the amount of scams, but also the sophistication of those scams and the different type of scams that's leading to a far greater amount of loss for institutions. We have recently worked on a primary research study with Forrester Consulting, where we went out and I want to say it's somewhere around 400-ish or so respondents across different types of financial institutions, from investment, retail investment organizations, to credit unions, to mid-sized, to large organizations, large banking organizations. We conducted a very interesting study where we asked, I want to say it was probably somewhere around 30-ish questions, really around a whole host of different areas of scam in terms of where they're finding the biggest challenges, what areas they're looking to invest in, what they're finding is successful, what type of payment mechanisms are most prevalent in those scams. And certainly something that came out, which is not really surprising, but it's very interesting when you do this type of primary research, is that 95% of the respondents clearly said, above everything else, that prioritizing improving customer experience was really important, not only from a detection perspective, but also from an outreach perspective. That they really wanted to have a good customer, even in this difficult experience, they wanted to have a good customer experience, because again, they felt that was something that was going to be vital to the overall mitigation of the scam. And you can see on the far right here that even NPS, the Net Promoter Score, as a proxy for that experience, our respondents said that was something that was very, very important to them as they went through this. And then certainly the prioritization of both transaction monitoring and payee as well as payor was something that was very important for them as well. And so I thought it was very interesting that both payee and payor were very high on the list in terms of areas that they wanted to work on. So if anybody's interested in, when we come out with that study, and we'll do another webinar, if folks are interested, please contact, let us know you're interested, and we're happy to include you in the invite when we publish and do the webinar on this really great piece of research. So Maria, I know we got a poll coming up. I'll hand it back to you for a few.
Yeah, sounds good. Thanks, Chris. So you should see the poll come up on the screen here. And if you can select one for us, which type of scams are you experiencing the most? I'll leave it up for a little bit for you guys to answer. Purchase scams, payment scams, or imposter scams. Looks like we're getting a healthy mix of both. Payment scams and imposter scams are leading, and then purchase scams are in last place. Payment scams seem to be the top one based off the answers. Chris, back to you.
Awesome. Thanks, Marie. Really appreciate that. So want to talk a little bit about how we here at LexisNexis Risk Solutions really think about the anatomy of a scam. And what we were doing was we were we were thinking about the, how would we break out the different pieces of a scam so that a couple of things. One is organizations can think about how to break it out from a diagnosis as well as a mitigation perspective, as well as how to align different type of capabilities with different unique portions of a scam. And we as we went through this, what we did was we said, well, it probably makes sense for us to have 3 separate sections: coaching, transfer, and mitigation. And in many ways, these sections would be ubiquitous across the different type of scams, as well as the different mechanisms of a scam. So as an example, both in a transfer as well as what I'll call where they're gathering data, gathering credentials. You would still have some type of transfer. Now, maybe transfer of credentials versus transfer of value. And obviously, if it's an authorized payment scam, it'd be different than if they're gathering or harvesting credentials. But we felt it'd be good to break these out into logical positions, so that as we look at, is the victim being, or the individual who's being coached, are we noticing something that's kind of odd going along with that session? And then when it's being transferred, if the value is being transferred, does it look out of band? The account that it's being sent to, does it look like a mule account? Does it have other risk signals associated with that? And then lastly, but certainly not least, when the organization is reaching out to that target individual, then you would certainly want to make sure that you can do that with confidence, that there's a way of being able to have specific language and customize that language to the individual in order to help them either stop or end the transaction, or somehow mitigate that fraudulent activity. So just a little bit about the coaching section here. This is really tricky, because in the coaching session here, sometimes that coaching or that interaction, that manipulation, can happen outside the ecosystem that the institution is part of. So it could be on, let's say, their desktop, and they've been in some type of interaction with somebody through a social media account. It could be on a home telephone that they're receiving a call. It could be their significant other or partners who's actually getting the phone call from somebody who's representing themselves as being part of either law enforcement or a federal agency or tech support. And so sometimes there is a complete disambiguation of the coaching activities. Now, if, as an example, it's on a device that has an app and the individual is conducting the transfer on an app, certainly in those cases there are, and David will get into this a little later, there are better and more signals that one can utilize for that. Then in the transfer component of it, this is where certainly there's a closer tie, because obviously for somebody to transfer funds out of their account into somebody else's account, in that case, certainly there would be more signals. The challenge here is that without some type of consortium data, it's difficult in sharing of that data. It can be a little tricky for the institution that it's being sent to, for the sending institution to be able to have better signals around that. And then lastly, but not least, certainly mitigation is very important. As we talked about earlier, in that research that we conducted, and certainly anecdotally conversations that both David and myself have had, that mitigation is a vital part of the overall experience. That as organizations think about that improvement in customer experience, how to maintain or improve that NPS, the Net Promoter Score, as a proxy for that experience, that outreach. And there's some very interesting research that has been done around that outreach in terms of, how do you have a talk track? How do you have some type of interactive dialogue that reduces the amount of shaming that could occur? Because certainly, and as I've spoken to friends and colleagues myself who have been scammed, as we talk about it, they're very embarrassed about it. They say, I consider myself an intelligent individual. I feel like I understand how things work and how fraudsters work, but man, I got scammed out of X amount of dollars, and I feel really embarrassed about it. So certainly mechanisms by which organizations can use language and specific words where they don't, as example, try to avoid referring to them as a victim. The more, they're a target, they were defrauded. And again, language that helps ease that correspondence, so that people are more willing to provide a greater amount of data that can then be put back into the system in order to really understand what happened, and then how to either mitigate or assist the consumer. Certainly, I know there's a lot of great work that's been going on in the industry, and as we were thinking about this, I know that the Fed Bank is doing a lot of very interesting work around scam classification, very similar to the work that they did a number of years ago around the fraud classifier. And as we were thinking about this, we really wanted to make sure that our taxonomy would fit into the scam classification that the Fed Bank is doing. And certainly as that research comes out, I'd encourage everybody to review that as well. I believe we've got another poll coming up here. I'll pass it back to you.
Yeah, thanks. So let me hit start polling. So you guys should see this on the screen here. In the next 12 months, which stage of a transfer scam are you looking to invest in most? Based off what Chris went over, the 3 stages that we've identified are coaching identification, transfer detection, or mitigation. Give you guys a few seconds to respond, and then we can see what the majority has answered. Looks like transfer detection is pretty much outbeating the other 2. So very interesting. Thank you guys for answering. And I think from here, I hand it over to David. David, you might be on mute.
Oh. Yeah.
We can hear you now.
There, can you hear me now?
Yes, we can.
Okay, perfect. Thank you. Yeah, and thanks for that. Thanks, Marie. And I just wanted to spend a few minutes as we talk about detecting and mitigating scams and the way to do that, kind of talking about that framework that Chris just defined. And I think it's really important for a couple of reasons. I mean, obviously, number one, it's just really trying to understand, what happened when a scam occurred, but especially when I put my hat on as a fraud investigator to go back and figure out what could we have done to prevent it. That formula, that framework is really important, because if you can take some time to look at identifying what's happening in that first phase in the victim coaching part, and maybe put some signals or things in place, and then take a look at, assessing the pay risk, all of a sudden you have a good amount of signals to tell you what you may or may want to step up for further mitigation. And so I think it's really important to look at it through that lens and use that framework when you're looking at your own situations with your own organizations to determine what's happening? Why is this fraud, these scams, why are they occurring? And what can we do to stop them? So I'm going to use that framework as I walk through this to kind of give you a good idea of ways that we found customers have been really effective with mitigating scams and putting the right framework in place. On this next slide, we have kind of the key talk track here and the key point, and that is the risk-based multi-layered approach. And multi-layered is key because one of the things that those of us that have been in the fraud space for a while have learned is that fraud evolves, fraud changes. Fraudsters aren't just sitting back doing the same thing over and over. They'll do that until it doesn't work anymore, and then they'll evolve. They'll change their tactics. So being able to put something in place in your organizations that allows you to have a multi-layered approach, that allows you that flexibility of being able to change, to add new signals, to look at new step-up authentication methods without having a heavy IT lift is important. And it's something that we found is effective for the organizations that do it. At the end of the day, as much as we'd love for there to be a silver bullet that will stop all fraud, it doesn't exist. And even if it did, it would only be probably a matter of months before fraudsters would figure out paths and avenues around it. So it makes sense to have that approach where you can put multi-layers in place, and where with those layers, you get some really good signals to be able to then pivot quickly and either add new layers in if you need them, or maybe add new signals in to help you navigate the whole process. That's really the key with a multi-layered approach. And the risk-based portion of it, we're going to talk a little bit about now as we move into each of these steps and look at, for example, the victim coaching part. What are some steps and some things you can do to help mitigate that? And that's what these next couple slides are going to be about. The first one is the victim coaching. And like Chris said earlier, that's always a challenge. And it's a challenge because, grandma who is going on her app to wire money to her boyfriend in Tunisia, right, has been having a relationship with that boyfriend in Tunisia, at least she thinks that's what she's been having for months now. And now all of a sudden, she's going in and he's coaching her on, or she is coaching him on doing some transactions. How do you know that's really happening? And how do you know it's not really the intent of that individual to truly wire money out of their account? Well, that's a tough one. But there are some really critical signals, things that you can do that can help make a difference in this. And I want to go over a couple of them, ones where we've seen real success with. And the first one is something many of you probably are familiar with Threat Metrics, and a company we at Lexis acquired probably about 5 years ago now. But Threat Metrics provides device intelligence and information about not only a device itself, but where that device has been, and all sorts of information about a network surrounding that device. And there's some really interesting signals that you can get when you're running a Threat Metrics in the background. Things like if that individual is on an active phone call while they're on the app transferring money, you can find that out real time. That's a great signal to look at to go, wait a minute, is the active call detection capability on? And if in fact that individual is on that active call, that might be a signal that you can use to take a look at, should we be doing something else on that device? Not only that, but in addition, you can also identify remote access. So, is this individual, maybe they're on the PC, but is their PC actually being driven by remote access? And if so, hey, that's another good signal to layer in to maybe identify if victim coaching is happening on this transaction. In addition, and you see we have the other bullet point up here of BehavioSec, that's another avenue that we're finding a lot of value in when it comes to situations like scams and victim coaching. And specifically what BehavioSec is, and you all may have heard of the behavioral biometrics, and there's a lot of different noise in the marketplace about behavioral biometrics, but BehavioSec is our version of that. And what we're able to do with BehavioSec is identify information about how the individual is interacting with their device. simple things like if it's an iPhone or a phone or a tablet, or if it's a PC, if it's a phone or tablet, how are they orienting it? Are they holding it vertically, horizontally? Are they using their right thumb, their left thumb? We're also able to look at the cadence with which an individual is entering their data into that machine. Are they doing a cadence that's normal for them when they're entering their password or their user ID, or is it indicative of coaching, which there are some really clear signals? Normally, if somebody's asking me to enter my data in, I may do it in a slightly different cadence. Now, again, none of these are silver bullets. None of these are, hey, that one thing is going to fraud. But when you layer things like that together, like the cadence with how I'm entering my user ID and my password is different than how I normally do that, that is a good signal, coupled with some of the other individual elements, like how whether a remote access is in place, or whether or not on my device I'm actually on an active phone call. If those signals are present, then there's a high indication that maybe victim coaching is going on, and that can then lead you to take a different step when it comes to the last part of this, which is the mitigation. That's kind of high level of that first step. The second step is real important as well, and that's where you're looking at assessing the payee risk, right? A couple different vectors here. First of all, with a tool like a ThreatMetrix, we have a consortium network. People that are using ThreatMetrix are sharing into that network whether or not a device, whether or not a phone number, whether or not an email, whether those things have been seen associated with risk. And that's very valuable information, because if you're getting ready to send money to an entity, and the phone number or the email address that's tied to the entity where the money is going to be sent is suspicious, has been associated with a lot of fraud recently, that's a signal you can use to help identify whether or not you might need to step up. You might need to do some additional verification for that individual. But in addition to that, we've got other tools. We've got Email Age, which again is quite a big consortium that takes a look at the email that may be associated with either the individual or the recipient of the money, and has that email been in the network and seen performing consistent good transactions, or is the opposite true? Has that email been tied to a lot of fraudulent transactions? In addition to that, how old is that email? How long has that email been in existence? And if you can get a signal to tell you, wait a minute, this person is performing a high-risk transaction, they're getting ready to wire $9,999 to an email that has only been established for a week, that in itself might be a signal you might want to take a step back and evaluate further. And then finally, the third product I'm going to mention real quickly is what we call Phone Finder. And what Phone Finder does is really it gives you a clear rank-ordered understanding of the associations between that phone number and an identity. And much like we talked about with the email, if I'm getting ready to wire a large amount of money to somebody and the phone number that's tied to that account, or the phone number that's associated with us wiring the money there is one that was recently established, is a prepaid cell phone that's only been around for a week, high risk. There's signals there that might make me want to go to this third step, which is the mitigation aspect. And from the mitigation perspective, really want to take a minute and talk about this, because I think it can be a challenging step, because like I said, you're dealing with somebody who may be convinced they're wiring money to the love of their life that they've known for 2 weeks. And who are you to step in the middle of that and go, wait a minute, are you sure this is what you want to do? But I think as organizations, we have a responsibility to at least raise some level of caution. And there are a couple different ways to do that, ways that you can do that I think are appropriate for the scenario. First of all, if you're looking at those first two steps and you identify that, hey, maybe there's some risk here, then push authentication is a great avenue for doing that. Literally with push authentication, what we're able to do is enable real-time alerts to those consumers within their app via pop-ups. So, if I'm actually on trying to do a transaction, you can either require that I log in and log out again. You can pop a pop-up that says, hey, this payee is suspicious. Maybe instructing them to call the call center or to reach out to you, adding a little bit of appropriate friction to the process so that there's a chance that individual who's potentially being taken advantage of in the scam has an avenue, has an out. Additionally, along those lines, everybody's familiar with the old standby one-time password, but one-time password, again, can be used the same way. You can not only send a code, but you can also send a message along with that code. Again, alerting the consumer to the fact that, this payee you're trying to send to is suspicious, or, we've detected some anomalous behavior. Please don't give this code to anyone else. If you're on the line with somebody else, don't share this code, but do respond back with, the appropriate code to us so we can go to the next step. Things you can do to help mitigate some of the issues and some of the scams for that consumer. And again, putting that consumer in the position of a little bit of power, of alerting them to the fact that this might not be a valid transaction and giving them an option to opt out, and bigger picture, making it more difficult for the scammer to take advantage. As you can see from all of those things, the real power is in all of them working together and in that multi-layered approach. It makes a lot of sense having the ability for all of those different tools to talk to each other, for looking at step one and seeing a couple signals that look a little suspicious, and maybe that determines you're going to step up and do some push out in the push authentication realm. But having those working together and having that layered approach is extremely valuable. The other part that I think gets overlooked sometimes is the difficulty in adding different products. I've worked with customers where there's a 6-month window that they can add products. And if they're outside of that 6-month window, they can't add new products till the next cycle. And when you have a scenario like that, believe me, fraudsters learn that and understand that, and they target those organizations right at the worst time possible. But if you have the right tool in place, a platform that allows you to very quickly make changes, turn products on or off, take different workflows and flow to a different type of mitigation with literally just a matter of a couple clicks, all of a sudden it makes it a lot harder for the fraudsters to take advantage. It makes those scams less likely to occur, and it puts you guys in a position of being able to mitigate some of this stuff much, much more efficiently. This next slide is one that I always like to talk to because, honestly, there's some things on the horizon, things that are occurring that have an impact, have an effect on scams and on us fraud fighters, how we fight fraud, right? Things that we all need to be paying attention to. The first one, not going to spend a lot of time on regulatory impacts, but guys, regulators are looking at this. Regulators are looking at the whole scam scenario. They're looking at the payer, the payee, who's responsible. As of right now, there's not any impending legislation, but that doesn't mean it can't happen quickly. And I know we've just recently seen some changes in stance around Zelle and around Zelle payments from the CFPB that has caused a bit of a different tact. This could happen overnight. The key thing, if you're paying attention to it, if you have a risk-based process in place, then you're going to be in a better situation to be able to minimize any regulatory impacts. But I think it's really important to pay attention to. In addition to that, the second part is the consumer expectations. I find this one really fascinating because the reality is you guys might not be out any money when a consumer gets scammed, but the reputational risk you face when the consumer is going to the media talking about the fact that they were scammed, and all of a sudden they throw your bank's name in the mix as the bank that participated in the scam. Well, no, you didn't participate, but the expectation from the consumer is that you have some checks and balances in place and can do something to help them. Again, a process like what we just outlined. And then the third one up here that I want to talk about, I think is really interesting, the whole generative AI. Not sure about you all, but I can definitely report that the quality of the spam emails that I'm getting, the quality of the grammar has improved lately quite a bit. They're a lot better, and they're a lot better one simple reason, right? Fraudsters aren't dumb. They're using generative AI to fine-tune the fraud email, fine-tune the message, in many cases, fine-tune the AI that they're using to make it more believable. That puts consumers at risk. That makes the likelihood that these scams are going to continue to grow and take off much greater. And so I think it's important to kind of pay attention to that and take a look at that whole generative AI part, not so much from the standpoint of how your organizations are using AI, but the reality that the fraudsters are using it themselves to try to make their pitches better, try to make them more efficient. And that's, unfortunately, the reality of the world that we're living in right now. At this point, I think, Marie, if I'm not mistaken, there is a poll coming up.
Yep, this is our last poll, so you guys should see it on the screen now. So based off what David just went over, some of these regulatory impacts, consumer expectations, and the rise in generative AI, which of these are most concerning to you and your organization for the future of scams and what this means for you? And again, I'll give it a minute and you guys can post your answers in there. I know it's hard to pick one, but try to pick one. So this is interesting. This is the first one that's pretty split. It looks like generative AI is taking the cake with consumer expectations with a close second and regulatory impacts falling third, but all seem very, very concerning to the audience. So thank you guys for participating in that one. And then at this point, I think we can transfer into our panel discussion. So Chris, do you want to get us started with this?
Yeah, that's great. Thanks so much, Marie, and thanks everyone for responding to the survey. That's certainly very, very helpful and very informative for everybody here. So, David, this is usually my favorite part of these type of sessions where we get to chat about the experience around this. I certainly, as you and your team and your colleagues, work with clients every day around different type of novel scam, fraud, different type of fraud events. I can imagine that one of the first things you probably hear is, all right, so where do I get started, right? And I'm sure also that different organizations are at different points along the maturity curve where they either feel that they don't have many capabilities for scams or that they feel that they're in a more mature area on that curve. So David, maybe we could talk a little bit about if an organization would say, well, how could you help us, or where should I get started? How would you start?
Yeah, good question, Chris. And I think you kind of hit the nail on the head. It's, part of it is understanding that maturity curve. Where are you right now when it comes to fraud mitigation? Are there tools you have in place currently? What are they doing? And then even more importantly, where are the gaps? And that's one of the things that LexisNexis we do really well is sit down with our customers and take a look at where you are and where are the gaps, and then kind of help build a plan for what are the most important pieces we need to focus on. There are lots of solutions. There's lots of different ways to tackle the problem, but it all starts with knowing what the problem is. And that's where we do a lot of work with customers in the early stages, doing data analytics, right? Taking a look at what kind of fraud have you had? What are you classifying that fraud as? We also kind of help work on doing, retros on the tools that are available. We're setting up some, proof of values where we can actually run some data behind the scenes for a while to see how it performs. But ultimately, both of those are trying to get you to a point of understanding what's happening. Where is the fraud? Where are the scams occurring? What are the different vectors? And then from there, it's a matter of, are the current tools enough? Can we tweak the current tools to make them solve the problem? Or do we need to add other pieces in to take a better stab at solving the problem? And that kind of brings up a question I have for you, Chris, kind of turn this around a little bit. One of the things that I found in talking to a lot of different customers has been, how do we classify fraud? And there's a lot of noise in that. We just recently did a study with a customer where they had classified fraud a certain way. We dove a little deeper into what they meant by that, did some analysis, and found that actually some of the fraud they were classifying one way really should have been classified another way. And that kind of helped them, bigger picture, identify the mistakes they were making. But talk to me a little bit from your perspective, Chris. What are you seeing around how fraud is being classified and some of the challenges organizations are having with that?
Sure. No, thanks, David. And certainly that is a daunting task. As I mentioned earlier, and I'm actually part of the Fed Bank's roundtable on this, on fraud classification, and the goal of that group was to create a definition of scams, and then B, create a sufficiently robust classification model that would help organizations to be able to put it into unique and different buckets. And certainly, as we look around the globe, a number of different other countries have been looking at doing something like this. Certainly, one of the first ones, many could argue, would be the UK finance, that has had some type of fraud classification. I think also a number of organizations have kind of almost a running list, where I've heard from different organizations that they have anywhere from half a dozen classification categories all the way up to in the dozens and dozens of categories. My sense is that probably the cross-industry, cross-discipline group that the Fed's pulled together, that's probably going to be a good place for folks to start once that's fully published. But certainly, looking at, is somebody an imposter? Is somebody creating a false page or a false site or a false app for a legitimate type of business? And then there's somebody is selling, a golden doodle, and there is no golden doodle for sale, but they're using that type of sale mechanism. I think one of the challenges, David, is also around a number of times, and you talked about this earlier in terms of whether you have the signals or don't have the signals. I think one of the challenges there is that sometimes it can be fairly difficult to understand. So as an example, you were talking about, your grandmother who has got a boyfriend in, some other place in the world, right? The challenge is if they're, as an example, having that conversation, that voice conversation via some type of VoIP technology or via some type of social media interaction, it's probably very difficult to understand what type of scam that is until it's actually occurred. And then through a case management process, you're able to ask them those questions. So certainly, I think, but if we think about, and we're probably dating ourselves here, David, if we think about ATO, let's call it even 10 plus years ago, it was very daunting for organizations saying, hey, I've got this new thing, it's called the internet, I got this app, got this web page, and fraudsters are actually like, taking over. They're doing password resets without me knowing about it, because they're basically just churning through thousands of username password combinations until organizations said, okay, you only get 3, or I'm going to put a velocity check on this. So I think that over time that it's not going to stop fraudsters from maturing around scams, But my sense is that over time, as we classify better and understand the mechanisms better, there'll certainly be an evolution, a further evolution in the diagnosis.
Yeah, most definitely.
Hey, thanks, David. So, how do maybe we can talk a little bit about how do your clients react to when they say, "Hey, this is great. We've talked about it. What are some next steps? Can we do a demo or a point or some type of pilot or proof of value?" How do organizations, how do your clients get started with actually testing and putting something like this into place to try to figure out how can I detect or mitigate and test out different ways of either detecting a scam or interacting with my client?
Yeah, yep. Good question, Chris. And a couple different ways. And as I mentioned before, part of it is kind of that initial assessment of what are you doing now, right? What are the, what are the steps you're taking now, but what are the problems? We do a lot of work, like I said, with data analytics, with being able to look at a customer's maybe last 3 months, 6 months transactions, maybe identifying those they've tagged as fraud, and then doing some analysis to find out what's unique about the fraud ones. What are they doing differently? Because what that helps us do is build a strategy to say, hey, here are some signals that if we can identify those, we're going to be a little bit closer to solving the problem. Unfortunately, what I think happens a lot of times is there's a temptation to sort of play whack-a-mole and just, oh, this is the latest. We saw some synthetics last month. We're going to focus on synthetics. And part of the value, I think, of taking a measured approach and trying to look at an overall strategy is to protect yourself against those future things that you don't know about yet. And that's why I think it's really important to not only look at the data, but also kind of do some analysis around how hard / easy is it going to be if I need to make a change, if I need to change a policy to route and be a little stricter and route more to, say, step-up authentication or to some other manual mitigation. How hard, easy is that going to be? And making sure you're building things like that in. But ultimately, Chris, to answer your question, it's a matter of sitting down, evaluating what's happening now, evaluating where the fraud is, and then coming up with a strategy for doing some testing. And, as I mentioned earlier, we work with a lot of different customers, both doing kind of retro data testing, but also doing some, live evaluation of tools like a threat metrics, where you can run it in the background for 60, 90 days and see what sort of signals it gives you so that you can evaluate how to best implement it and how to best incorporate it so that it works for your organization.
No, that's great. Thanks, David. And certainly want to remind everybody that, if you have any questions you'd like to post yourself, please feel free to put it into the Q&A section. If you'd like us to answer any of your questions on this. Just going along with that, David, how have you seen organizations dealing with the evolution of scams? And I suppose maybe it'd be helpful also if you got examples of different type of fraud types, but certainly have you observed how organizations are really dealing with the evolution of scams?
Hey, David, can you hear us?
Yeah, I can hear you now. Sorry about that.
Oh, looks like he dropped off.
We may have lost him. Sorry about the technical difficulties, you guys. In the meantime, we can take some questions in the Q&A. It looks like we have one, Chris, if you don't mind tackling this one. How do you foresee generative AI really impacting scams? I know David touched on this one a bit, and I don't know if you have anything to add to it.
Yeah, no, I think it's a great question. Hey, David, I see you're back. Awesome.
Yeah.
So a couple things. One is I think that it's probably potentially too early to tell. I actually conducted a group meeting yesterday with a number of our clients where we talked about different type of attack vectors. We discussed generative AI as one of them, and many of them felt that generative AI is certainly has the possibility of a challenge. But right now they see it more as and I love the term somebody used, I didn't make it up myself, as more of a horizon risk versus a risk today. Our initial sense, and we continue to reach out to our clients and understand, one, how are you utilizing generative AI to both analyze and detect some type of fraudulent or scam activities, and then the other part of that is how do you perceive fraudsters will be using it? Certainly the one, because if you think about generative AI, you've got, like, as an example, you've got like text to text. That's the one that we see mostly with LLMs. Then you've got text to image, text to video, text to task, and a number of different iterations of that. So certainly when we think about an individual who can write more introductions, scam emails, scam texts, and so forth, certainly that enables the fraudster maybe not to come up with novel scams, but certainly to have a broader array of that. I think also with as David mentioned earlier, not only are the spam and scam type of emails getting better from a grammatical perspective, but also the ability for fraudsters to both write and interpret or read in different languages certainly adds to that. Next down on the list then is probably around face and what I call voice modulation. The challenge with all of these, at least in the state of generative AI today, it is not as high velocity as let's say being able to use bots or rats or different type of more what I call traditional cyber type of threat vectors. Hopefully that makes sense, Marie.
Yep.
Yeah, absolutely. And David, before we lost you, Chris was just asking about kind of how you perceive organizations' outlook on the evolution of scams and how they can tackle it. I don't know if you have anything you want to respond to that one.
Yeah, I think I think the big challenge, right, is the temptation to react to scams versus having a strategy up front. And I think a lot of organizations are realizing that reputational risk factor. And while even though it may not be a true fraud loss initially, there's impact to the organization. So I think organizations are realizing they've got to look beyond just the fraud loss part of it, and I think that's critical. And what's interesting is the processes, the risk-based approach is the same. It's just having it geared slightly differently to mitigate scams versus just mitigating a true fraud loss. But it still follows the same path. And so I think organizationally, I think the realization that this can have a much greater impact from a reputation standpoint is important. And I think that's how at least a lot of the customers I'm working with are starting to approach it.
Chris, do you have anything else you want to add before we close things out?
No, I just want to say certainly appreciate it, everybody's time today listening in. Certainly look forward to chatting with folks more And I know, Marie, you're going to be talking about how folks can get in contact with us to have a further dialogue.
Yeah, absolutely. So I've left our contact information on the screen here. I know for me personally, I always think of questions after the fact. So if you guys think of anything or want to reach out and get in contact with us to dive into this conversation a little bit deeper, here's our contact information. Again, just thank you guys for joining us. Thank you so much, Chris and David, for this presentation. I hope everyone in the audience found it very valuable. I know I did. So as mentioned, if for any reason you had a question that we didn't get to today, we'll follow up with you individually within the next several days, or you can reach out to us directly here. And then as a thank you to everyone who joined us today, we will be sending you a version of our latest scams ebook that goes into this information in great detail. So look out for that follow-up email in the next couple of days, along with a recording of this webinar on demand. So thank you, everyone. That concludes today's presentation, and I hope you all have a great rest of your day. Thank you so much.
Thank you.
Thank
Bye-bye.
you.